let's go over the peripheral nervous system, right? So far, keep in mind, we talked about the brain already and the spinal cord, right? Those two comprise the CNS, the central nervous system. So we went ahead and broke down actually all of the divisions of the brain, the smaller regions of the brain in terms of their function and their structures. So now let's go ahead and move on to the other part of the nervous system, right? The one that actually deals with the body directly and controls the body. There's a lot of homeostasis involved here, right? A lot of homeostasis. And again, we'll go over that in a bit. So two divisions here. One is we have the peripheral nervous system sensory side or sensory division. We know that as the afferent peripheral nervous system. Then we have the other one, which we talked about already, right? This is the motor or the efferent division of the peripheral nervous system. So again, afferent sensory, efferent motor. We talked about motor already, right? So all the skeletal muscles that allow us to move, and we move consciously, we think about moving. All of that is skeletal muscle, right? That was a whole unit we did a couple of weeks ago. So we're not gonna talk about that other than just describing how action potentials move down the nerves, and that's it. Now this one here, we do need to describe, right, and hash out differences between efferent and afferent firing, if you will. So sensory and efferent, and motor, sorry. So then we have a visceral sensory division as well. Visceral stands for organs, right? So a sensory division in terms of the organ, and then we have a motor division when talking about the organs as well. And this one's controlled specifically by the autonomic nervous system, which is topic of today, right? So I'm going to introduce you guys to things like the heart, heart rate, blood pressure, right? Urination as well. But keep in mind, those are Anatomy 2 concepts, right? So you're going to have entire units in Anatomy 2 with the cardiovascular system. My job in Anatomy 1 is to introduce you to those through the ANS. But once you get to Anatomy 2, whoever you take it with, you're going to study these in depth. All right. So here we have the connection between the CNS, which is the spinal cord, and the PNS, which is the nerve, right? So this is a nerve, a spinal nerve specifically, joining with the lateral aspect of the spinal cord, right? So notice the connection right there. This is the connection between the two, right? So there's action potentials that go back and forth. If the action potential comes from the body into the nerve, right, and it's relayed over to the spinal cord, from the spinal cord over to the brain, then that's a sensory action potential. If it must return, it has to return in the way of a motor stimulation, of a motor action potential. Why is that? Well, because if it returns, then the brain determined that there was some sort of movement that was required. So it's going to go ahead and send it back down through the spinal cord, and then it's going to go ahead and make it over to the motor division of the spinal nerve, and then back to the part of the body that needs to move. Right, so that's more or less the interplay between the two. So a bird's eye view, if you will. So we have a front and back here, right? So a front and back, two divisions, two branches of this spinal nerve. One is the anterior root, right? So this is literally in the front, if you will, facing the front of the body. And then this is the posterior. This is facing the back of the body. So dorsal or posterior, and then ventral or anterior. Now, this part that bulges out, right? So it goes ahead and bulges. There's a high amount of cell bodies that are found within this bulge. And the bulge is known as a ganglion. And this is specifically a posterior root ganglion. All right, so those two merge onto the actual spinal nerve, and the nerve is made up of millions, right? So thousands to millions of neurons, right? This is a bundle of axons essentially that comprises the actual nerve. There's many of them, hundreds of thousands, even millions within the nerve, right? So zooming in on the actual nerve, this is an actual one under scanning electron microscope. Okay, so you're looking at the entire nerve, right there. Inside the nerve, there's divisions. Those divisions are called fascicles. You can see them, right? You can see them right there. That's a fascicle, 2, 3, 4. I guess this is a better view. That's one fascicle, another one, another one, another one, right? So there's many. Obviously more than you're looking at here. Right, this is an animation right there. So inside the fascicles, that's where the neurons are located. Now, notice the actual divisions for each one, right? The outer coverings of each one. We have epineuron around the entire nerve. It's right there. It's connective tissue. That's essentially what it is. And there's perineum or perineum, my goodness, perineum, I'm sorry, around each fascicle, as you can see, right? Each one of these fascicles contains perineum. Again, connective tissue that is insulating and protecting and holding the structure of everything here. Now, the last site would be the endoneurium. So this is the inner, the deeper aspect of the nerve, right? So each one of these axons is surrounded by endoneurium, and that's again connective tissue surrounding each one of those axons. And lastly, we have myelin, right, which wraps around one single axon right there. So again, that's the structure of the nerve. Notice how blood vessels penetrate through the nerve, right? So veins in blue, arteries in red. Arteries are bringing oxygenated blood with nutrients over to the nerve, right? And then whatever byproducts the axons are putting out, they go back using the vein, right? So they go back to the general systemic circulation so that we can go ahead and get rid of those byproducts. All right. So let's talk about the actual nerves themselves, because the nerves evidently make up the peripheral nervous system. All right, so there's two divisions to the nerves. We have the cranial nerves, and then we have the spinal nerves. Again, cranial nerves and spinal nerves. So we're going to go ahead and talk about each one of those. First is we have the olfactory nerve. So the olfactory nerve, as you notice here in the diagram, it has an origin in the diencephalon, right? So here's the diencephalon of the brain where the thalamus is located, the hypothalamus, and the subthalamus, and so on, right? So the olfactory nerve originates there. It goes ahead and runs all the way anteriorly until it hits the ethmoid bone, right? So this ethmoid bone right there has perforations. It has tiny little holes, and those holes allow for projections of the olfactory nerve to essentially to stick out into the nasal cavity, right? So they go ahead and project out into the nasal cavity to start detecting, right, all of those odorants, all of those molecules that you're breathing in, right? So just picture, right, this person breathing in, all that air moving in, that air is gonna become dissolved in mucus that's located along the borders, if you will. So it dissolves, and those odorants cause action potentials to be triggered here in these nerve endings. So the action potential goes in transfers over to the olfactory tract, down into the origins of the olfactory nerve, right, which is deep within the brain, essentially. So that's how the brain is able to utilize olfactory nerve for smell. Okay, so the next one is the optic nerve. The optic nerve originates in the retina, right? So here's the retina of the eye, both eyes, right and left. That's where the optic nerve originates, right? So the retina converges into all of the axons that are going to make up the optic nerve. So both nerves converge onto the optic chiasma, which is located in the diencephalon, very close to the thalamus. So they converge, they cross over, and then form projections all the way to the back of the brain, of the cerebrum, right? This is the occipital lobe, as you hopefully remember, right? So the right side, the left side, right occipital, left occipital. That's what's special about the optic nerve. That it makes those, it builds those, it makes those different connections, if you will. And by the way, that crossing over is known as a decussation. Right? So that's a decussation right there. So these nerves decussate, they cross over. All right, so the next one is going to be the vestibulocochlear nerve. That one is going to go ahead and originate on the medulla oblongata, right? So this is the lower part of the brainstem. So that's where the origin of the vestibulocochlear nerve is. It goes ahead and extends and branches into the inner ear, right? The inner ear has two structures in and of itself. It's got the vestibule, which is these semicircular canals right there. And it's got the cochlea, which is right here, this nail-like structure, that's the cochlea. So this structure, it's for hearing. And this structure here is for balance, right? So we'll go over the special senses. I believe it's the next, if I'm not mistaken, one of the last lectures. But real quick, semicircular canals play a role in keeping our not our posture, but our balance. And then the cochlea plays a role in hearing, right? So both of those structures have their own nerves. For example, there's a vestibular nerve right there, and the cochlea has its own nerve, the cochlear nerve. But both of these originate from the vestibulocochlear nerve, right? Which originates on the medulla oblongata. And by the way, all of these cranial nerves have an origin on the brainstem. Right? So all of them have an origin on the brainstem. If they don't originate there, like these two, like the olfactory and the optic, then they interact with some part of the brainstem at some point. Okay, so the next one here is a motor cranial nerve. These three are sensory, meaning that there's no parts that need to move. It's only sensory information. If it says motor, if it's a motor nerve, then there will be some sort of structure that needs to be moved. In this case, it's the eye, right? So we have three nerves right here: oculomotor, trochlear, and abducens nerves. These three take care of the movement of the eyes, right? So lateral movement, upwards, downwards, diagonal, and so on. So let's take a look at each one, starting with the superior most, which is the trochlear nerve. So it originates on the midbrain. This is the upper part of the brainstem right here. So it extends all the way over to the to the trochlear muscle right here. This is the superior oblique muscle that that is connected to the trochlea. So one of the lectures, right, I talked about all of these muscles. It turns out that the contraction of this muscle moves the eye diagonally, so like at an angle, if you will. So again, it's controlled by the trochlear nerve. The second one here is the oculomotor nerve. This one originates also on the midbrain, and it extends all the way over to the rectus superior, the rectus lateral, and the rectus inferior. It's got 3 branches. These muscles control the eye's movement, whether it's upward. So if you're talking about the superior one, then its contraction pulls the eye towards the back, and that rotates right upward so you can see up. If the bottom one is stimulated by the oculomotor nerve, then it pulls downwards and you can see down. Now, if the lateral rectus is stimulated, then it's going to go ahead and pull to the side so you can see. So you can obviously see to the right or the left, right? The abducens is also gonna help. It's gonna have divisions, right, all over the place here. So all of these 3 nerves control the movement of the eye. So notice how there's no sensory part. It's only motor, right? The sensory part is over here. It's the optic. All right, so here's the next 2. We're still motor, right? So we're looking at the hypoglossal nerve and the accessory nerve. So this hypoglossal nerve originates in the medulla as well. And this would be the medulla oblongata of the brainstem, obviously, right? So this is the bottom part of the medulla. So that's its origin, and then it extends all the way down and forms many branches onto every single one of our lingual muscles, right? So all of the muscles that move the tongue. Okay, so that's what it does. That's what the hypoglossal nerve does. It controls the movement of the tongue muscles. The next one here is the accessory nerve, which originates even further down into the medulla, almost down with the connection to the spinal cord, but not quite. It's still in the medulla oblongata right there. So its divisions control a couple of muscles here of the neck. First, we have the sternocleidomastoid, which rotates the head, right, and flexes the head, or at least plays a role, right, because there's many muscles that do that. And then there's also the trapezius, which is a rather large muscle located in the back, but its upper end forms a connection with the occipital bone, right, to go ahead and hyperextend, if you will, the head. So that's what the accessory nerve is going to do, right, as well as the hypoglossal. Okay, next ones, we have mixed cranial nerves. What does that mean? Well, that means that these nerves are going to have 2 functionalities. They're going to go ahead and have sensory divisions, and they're also going to have motor divisions. For example, we have the trigeminal nerve with its sensory function, right? So this nerve originates on the pons. So it originates from the pons, which is the middle section of the brainstem, and then it goes and forms many divisions, right? A lot of divisions that go in and control the sensory aspect of the entire face. So the trigeminal nerve controls, again, sensory aspect of the entire face, all facial structures, including the ophthalmic branch, which is the eye, the maxillary branch right here, all of the superficial structures of the maxillary, like the skin, for example, the glands, right? And then the mandibular branch right here, which sends out its divisions right into the mouth, right? So the entire the insides of the oral cavity, if you will, in terms of sensory function, is controlled by the mandibular branch. So this is not motor, this is sensory only. Here's the motor, right? The mandibular nerve it goes ahead and controls the only movable joint of the skull, which is a TMJ, right? So the temporomandibular joint right there is controlled by the mandibular nerve, which is part of the trigeminal nerve, right? But the motor aspect of it. So what does it do? It's going to go and control three sets of muscles, right? The masseter, the pterygoids, which are deeper, and the temporalis. Those three are going to go ahead and take care of mastication. So the movement of the mandible, it's depression and elevation, depression, elevation. Okay, so now we have the facial nerve. We have the sensory aspect and then we have the motor aspect of it. So sensory controls the lacrimal glands, the nasal cavity, the palate, sensory aspect of the tongue, the salivary glands, right? All of these are controlled by the facial nerve specifically. And this one originates in the inferior pons. That's its origin right there. Now, the motor division takes care of the other facial muscles, right? That I haven't talked about. These were mandible, right, muscles. Now, these are the rest of the facial muscles. All right, so we have the frontalis muscle right here, orbicularis oculi, orbicularis of the mouth, as well as every single other muscle that plays a role in facial expressions. Right, again, and that's the facial nerve motor and facial nerve sensory. And then we have the last one here, which is the vagus, or the last two rather, glossopharyngeal and vagus nerve. Right, so the glossopharyngeal right here is it's going to have a couple of functions here. And this is a mixed cranial nerve, by the way, sensory and motor. Glosso stands for tongue, and pharyngeal, the pharynx, if you will, so the throat. So it's going to go ahead and play a role in controlling also muscles of the tongue, but a sensory aspect as well. And then as well as the pharynx, right? So all of the muscles of the pharynx that control the movement of the pharynx as you breathe in, as you breathe out, or as you pass food from the oral cavity into the stomach, right there. So that's glossopharyngeal. The last one here is the vagus nerve. And this one's arguably the longest nerve that we have and the most extensive one in the entire body, right? Why is that? Well, because the vagus nerve controls many structures, right? It goes ahead and plays a role in, for example, controlling parts of the pharynx, right, of the throat. It sends out divisions and branches into the lungs. It also sends out divisions and branches into the heart, right? So it's going to go ahead and control heart rate, blood pressure indirectly. It's going to control the respiratory rate, inspiring, expiring, and that's obviously because of the lungs. It can also control the airways, right? The opening, dilation of the airways or the constriction of the airways. It plays a role in it. And then it sends branches all the way down to the stomach. And not only the stomach, but the kidneys, right? And the small intestine, the large intestine, the liver even, right? So again, one of the longest nerves and also the most diversified, if you will, nerves. And that's the vagus nerve right there. So I described the function of it in terms of cardiovascular and respiratory, right? But then it plays a role in digestion as well. there's this function of digestion called peristalsis. And the vagus nerve is involved in controlling peristalsis. Peristalsis is the rhythmic contraction of the entire alimentary canal, starting in the esophagus. It's essentially a contraction that goes all the way down from the throat to the stomach, and then that's the churning of the stomach as well is part of peristalsis. From there, those waves, those contractions, are sent to the small intestine, and then onto the large intestine, so that waste can be moved, right, and expelled from the body. So that's why the vagus nerve is one of the most important cranial nerves, and one of the longest and the most branched. All right, so that's just an overview of everything that was just described here. Let's move on. Bell's palsy, right? So one of the, I guess, disorders of the cranial nerves here. This is specifically the facial nerve. There was some sort of infection by a virus, but it can also be caused by a tumor, trauma, right? And it's essentially the paralysis which leads to weakness of some facial muscles here. Okay. So now in terms of spinal nerves, right? Spinal nerves, they work, it's very complex. They have to handle a lot of information coming in and out, right? So coming from body up to the brain and then back from the brain down to the body. So they have to coordinate a lot. And they also have to build those channels of communication effectively, so that the signals are not reduced, right? So they're not diminished. Otherwise, obviously, there's going to be problems. Right? So here it is. Here, this is a spinal cord, and then we have the branchings of the nerve, the spinal nerves. So we, again, like I said, we have information coming from the body into the nerve, up into the spinal cord, from the spinal cord up to the brain. You don't see that one, right? But it is happening essentially at all times. If the brain must respond with movement, then it's going to send information down through the motor aspect, right, of these nerves, and then transfer the information to wherever it needs to go. It needs to pass through the ANS, and if it's motor information, then it's most likely going to be sympathetic, because the autonomic nervous system has two major divisions, sympathetic and parasympathetic. So the sympathetic division is also known as your fight or flight response, right? So when you need to activate, move quickly and respond quickly, then you're probably going to use your motor sympathetic aspect to allow you to do that. Right? So now the other one, the parasympathetic, that's known as the rest and digest. So there's not a lot of necessarily movement that's going on. It's more homeostatic functioning, and I'll get into that in a bit. So here are the cranial nerves. So we know these divisions already. We've been studying these divisions since the beginning of the semester, right? So it's going to be easier, if you will, to remember them. First is we have the cervical aspect of the spinal cord. So these 8 pairs of nerves originate from the cervical region, and those are cervical nerves, so 1 through 8. Right, so 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. On one side, right? On the other side, there's another 8. So really, it's 8 pairs of cervical nerves. We'll get into the functions of them in a bit. The next ones here are going to be the thoracic. And we have 12 pairs of thoracic nerves, right? Starting in T1 all the way down to in T12, if you will, right? So all the way down to here. That's thoracic. From the thoracic, we have lumbar, and we have 5. Right? So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And notice how the gaps start to become bigger. And from there, we have sacral, S1 through S5. And then last one not least, is we have coccygeal, which is coccygeal CO1, right there. Now, as you might imagine, right, cervical nerves are going to go ahead and control all of the structures of the neck and the shoulders, right? So they form divisions that extend out into the entire neck, everything inside of the neck, and the shoulders. Some of them even send down branches down to the limbs, right, and to the scapula right here. But for those, we're going to have specific nerves, plexuses rather, that control those. And here it is. So like the brachial plexus, for example, C5 to T1. The brachial plexus sends out divisions, right, branches of nerves down into the arms to go ahead and control the entire sensory and motor aspect of the arms. So that's the brachial plexus right there. The name kind of gives it to you, right? Brachial. That means arm. Okay, so thoracic nerves 1 through 12, they're going to wrap around the entire rib cage, right? So the entire chest region and most of the upper abdominal region. That's what thoracic nerves are going to do. They're going to go and control all of the thoracic structures, everything inside the rib cage, including all types of tissue, right, that we've talked about so far. If it's in this region, then there's a nerve that's going to go and control that. And we'll get specific in a bit. Lumbar plexus is next. So this one's going to go and control not only the lumbar, the back region, but also the anterior region. So there's a lot of digestive structures that are controlled by nerves L1 through L4, right? And these are nerves. These are big bundles of axons. But ultimately, they make divisions, branches. They branch out extensively, right, to be able to reach all tissues of the lumbar / lower abdominal region. Next is sacral plexus right here. This one controls mostly mostly reproductive structures and also sacral region structures of the back. Right. So then lastly, we have the coccygeal nerve. Coccygeal nerve controls mostly reproductive structures. So these are pelvic, I'm sorry. Sacral is pelvic and coccygeal is mostly reproductive. Okay, so let's get a bit more specific. What we're looking at here is the cervical plexus. Okay, so look at the branchings of these nerves, C1, C2, C3, 4, and 5. So it starts as a big bundle of axons, but ultimately it's going to go ahead and branch out into many, many divisions, more than what we're looking at here. All right, so what does that say, right? We can infer that any given nerve, nerve within the cervical region is going to go ahead and control not only one part, but many parts of the neck. All right, so that's essentially what this is saying, right? So we have a lesser occipital, for example, division. We have a greater auricular division, ansa cervicalis, a transverse cervical division, supraclavicular division here, and then a phrenic division, right? So C2 would be lesser occipital. So this would go and control, as the name implies, the bottom aspect of the occipital region in every structure located there, right? Including the skin, the ear, and so on. Mostly sensory. The greater auricular region, this is mostly ear, right? The name kind of gives it to you. Auricular means hearing or dealing with the ear, right? So C2 and C3. Ansa cervicalis, that's C1 through C3. Notice how they start, right? They start kind of overlapping, right? So this one here is going to go and control muscles of the tongue. So underneath the tongue that have an origin on the hyoid bone, like the geniohyoid, the infrahyoid, those are controlled by the ansa cervicalis. Right? Next is the transverse cervical, C2 and C3. Again, a lot of overlap between these three. So this controls regions of the chest, the upper part of the chest, or lower part of the shoulder. And that's essentially what it does. It's going to send out many different divisions, subdivisions, out into the shoulder and upper part of the chest. The supraclavicular, so this is everything above the clavicle, right? So a lot of the shoulder region, C3 and C4. And lastly, the phrenic. Phrenic stands for the diaphragm. All right, so the diaphragm is going to be controlled by this phrenic nerve, which originates on C3, but has branches of C4 and C5. All right, so again, the diaphragm. If you recall, the diaphragm plays a role in respiration. Excuse me, in respiration. So the brain, right, can go ahead and send out signals to C3 or C4 and C5, which are going to go ahead and indirectly control phrenic action potentials to be able to control the movement of the diaphragm. If it contracts, it pulls the lungs down to be able to expand those lungs so that we can breathe in, right? If it relaxes, then they do the opposite. They go ahead and it squeezes the lungs, if you will, to allow us to breathe out. Okay. So next one here is the brachial plexus, right? So everything that controls the arm. So we're looking at a few trunks and cords, if you will. We're looking at superior, middle, and inferior trunks. Superior, middle, inferior. And then the cords come off of the trunks. We have a lateral, medial, posterior. These two control everything anterior, right? So in the front. And then this last one has branchings towards the back. All right, so that would be posterior cord right there. All right, so now those that extend into the arm are going to be superior, middle, and the inferior trunks. Those are going to divide into the lateral cord, posterior, medial cord, musculocutaneous nerve, which controls, it's going to go ahead and control most of the muscles here of the upper arm. The median nerve, the axillary nerve, radial and ulnar nerve. Right? So again, it all starts here on the top with a rather thick bundle of nerve and axons here. From there, they're going to go ahead and branch out into median, axillary, radial, and ulnar. And all of those control the rest of the arm, right? So starting superiorly here, median and axillary control everything around the armpit, right? So all the structures that are around the armpit, including skin, muscles, and all tissue that's around here. All right, so those branch out into the radial and ulnar nerves, which control further the muscles, skin, bones, right, of the lower aspect of the arm, the rest of the arm, if you will. All right, so brachial plexus from C5 all the way to D1. Yeah, so that's another iteration of what was just said. Axillary, median, right here in the armpit region. Radial nerve controls mostly, and musculocutaneous nerve, mostly upper arm, all the way down to where the radius is located. Median and ulnar nerve control the rest of the forearm as well as the hand. Okay, so moving down, we're gonna skip the thoracic region because we'll talk about it in the ANS. Moving down to the lumbar plexus right here. Lumbar plexus from L1 all the way down to L5. We have iliohypogastric nerve, ilioinguinal nerve, genitofemoral nerve, the femoral nerve, lateral femoral nerve, and obturator nerve right here. So what do they do, right? So the iliohypogastric nerve is gonna go and have two major divisions. One down into the pelvis, and that would be the ilio part of it. And the other one to the lower gastric region. Okay, so right below the stomach, if you will. So this one's gonna extend so everything below the stomach to include the lower digestive tract. All right, so the ilio part, again, extends into the pelvic cavity. Next is the ilioinguinal, right? Ilio is pelvic, inguinal is down lower into the groin region right here, right? So that's the division right there. L1 is the origin, right? So this division controls other pelvic regions as well as groin regions. The genitofemoral nerve. So genito refers to the genitals, to reproductive structures, and then femoral refers to the femoral or the femur, if you will, so the leg. So two major divisions to that one. And then we get into the femoral nerve, which is mostly leg, right? So this nerve here extends out extensively, branches out extensively into the leg. Lateral femoral is mostly lateral but outer, right, region. And then obturator mostly deals with the adductor muscles of the legs, which are located, again, down deep into the groin region right here. Okay, so then we have the sacral plexus. Sacral plexus runs from L4 all the way down to S4. So L4 down to S4. Okay, so a few major divisions here. First is we have the superior gluteal nerve, which, as the name implies, controls the buttocks. That's the contraction of the gluteal muscles that give rise to the buttocks. And then we have the inferior gluteal nerve. So these are deeper buttocks and pelvic muscles that are controlled by this nerve. The third division is the sciatic nerve, which extends down into the lower leg, right? So this one has subdivisions. We have tibial, fibular, pudendal, and femoral divisions. All right, so let's see. Here it is. So superior gluteal nerve, I think I talked about that one. So these two, again, are buttocks region. Pudendal nerve, we have down, this one extends down into the hamstrings region. The posterior femoral, also down into the hamstrings region, forming a longer connection down that goes down into all the way to the tibia. And then the sciatic nerve, which is the major nerve that runs all the way down into the feet, with some divisions like the fibular and the tibial nerves, which control its respective structures, like the everything close to the fibula, which is located here, and the tibia here. All right, so the rest of the foot, again, controlled by the sciatic nerve, or divisions rather, of the sciatic nerve. Okay, so here it is. So now what I'm showing here is the distribution of the locations of the body that are controlled by the nerves that we just described here. For example, the cervical plexus, right, controls mostly shoulder and superior thoracic, right, as well as a bit of the arm here. Let's see. So lumbar plexus here. Keep in mind it extends down into the femoral, the obturator, which is adductor muscles of the leg, the femoral nerve, and so on. Right. So again, just showing how all of those nerves have larger regions that they control, and those can be mixed. They can be sensory and also motor. Okay, cool. So that's PNS. Let's go ahead and move down to the ANS. So the autonomic nervous system. This is again mostly the physiology, right, of the PNS, because the ANS, which we're about to talk about, it uses all of the nerves, right, to be able to transfer information from the brain down to the body, right? So there's a lot of homeostasis that's involved here, and again, we'll go ahead and go deep into those in a bit. So what's happening here? How does this thing work, right? So again, a reiteration that of what was already stated, but adding something called a ganglion, if you will, an autonomic ganglion. This is what differentiates the autonomic nervous system from the PNS, right? The fact that there's ganglia associated with that. Ganglia are like mediating / meeting places, right, of the PNS and ANS. Okay, so they're bulges, right, that contain mostly cell bodies that allow for the interconnection between the spinal cord and the nerves, right? So that allows for the relay of information from the actual organ to the spinal cord, up into the brain, and then down from the brain to the spinal cord, to the ganglion, back to the organ right there. Okay, so in terms of the neurons of autonomic structures, right? These we've talked about already, right? Somatic nervous system. These are neurons that control skeletal muscle. Notice how long they are. So these have long axons that are myelinated, right? And they need to be myelinated because of the length of their axons, right? So if they weren't myelinated, then these axons would lose. They would lose power, if you will. Right? So they would lose the action potential, ultimately leading to a very weak stimulation of the muscle. That's why we have myelin around them, so that myelin can help them insulate and speed up those potentials. Now, the autonomic nervous system has a set of neurons, right? At least two neurons, sometimes an interneuron in between the two. So there's a pre-ganglionic neuron, and then there's a post-ganglionic neuron. All right, so again, pre-ganglionic, post-ganglionic. Now, keep in mind, two divisions to the ANS, right? We have the sympathetic and the parasympathetic. So these are going to differ in length depending on whether you're talking about the parasympathetic or the sympathetic division. right? So the sympathetic division has, for example, shorter preganglionic neurons and longer postganglionic neurons, right? So, and the parasympathetic is different. They have longer pre and shorter post. But again, and here it is. I'm sorry, I forgot I had this slide right there. This is what I mean by that. The sympathetic division, for example, right? Again, two divisions to the ANS, sympathetic and parasympathetic. The sympathetic division utilizes a spinal interneuron that connects the spinal cord to the ganglion. And this ganglion is located a few inches, just a couple inches away from the spinal cord. All right, so this preganglionic neuron is very short in relation to the postganglionic neuron, which is very long. All right, so that post connects all the way down to the target tissue, and it transfers the signal from the brain to the spinal cord to the interneuron, to the ganglionic neuron to the postganglionic neuron. And here's the ganglion right there, again. This is an accumulation of cell bodies of postganglionic neurons. In other words, there's many cell bodies, millions of them within one ganglion. Now, the parasympathetic system is opposite. There's still a ganglion, but this ganglion is located either inside of the organ or very close to the organ, meaning that it's going to be far away from the spinal cord, right? And that's the opposite as the sympathetic nervous system. So the parasympathetic nervous system is going to have a very long preganglionic neuron and then a ganglion with a very short postganglionic neuron right there. All right, so again, basic differences between the two. And here's a reason why, right? Just a couple inches away from the spinal cord on both sides, right and left, we have something called a sympathetic ganglion chain. And here it is. I know it's not an ideal image. I should have I probably have a cadaver image later on. I'll come back to it. Just a couple of inches away, right, from the spinal cord, there's this chain of ganglion running vertically, right? And it's many of them, top to bottom. Those are interconnected. Those are interconnected by nerves, which allow for the routing and relaying of signals that come from the brain. And there's a reason for that, because the sympathetic nervous system needs to be activated in different ways, in different manners. And I'll go over those ways in a bit. There's 3 ways. But this is essentially what it comes down to. This is why the sympathetic division has a shorter preganglionic neuron and a longer postganglionic neuron. All right. Now, also notice the origin of the sympathetic nervous system. The origin is mostly thoracic and lumbar. Right. So it occupies the entire thoracic, spinal nerve area, if you will, as well as part of the lumbar region. This is where the sympathetic nervous system originates from. So all of the organs that need sympathetic stimulation will get stimulation from these nerves, thoracic and lumbar nerves. All of them being connected directly to a ganglion within the sympathetic ganglion chain, right? Like all of them. This is just naturally the way in which this is arranged. Now, the parasympathetic division here, it also has ganglia rather, but they're not close to the spinal cord. They're either inside of the organ or close to the organ. Therefore, the neurons that connect to those ganglia need to be very long, right? So they're going to be very long. They extend into the ganglion. And then from there, a postganglionic neuron connects the ganglion to the organ. And then notice the origin of the parasympathetic division. It originates on the brainstem. Okay, so all of the cranial nerves that I described earlier, all of those are parasympathetic. And then they also originate on the sacral region. All right, so again, brainstem and sacral right there. Those are parasympathetic nerves. Okay. So what we're looking at here is a ganglion that is very close to the spinal cord. Therefore, this must be sympathetic. The point from this slide is that the action potential that is sent from the brain down the spinal cord into the sympathetic ganglia, right, is gonna go and flow in this direction, right, from the preganglionic neuron. From the spinal cord to the preganglionic neuron over to a ganglion, and then either up into another ganglion or from the same ganglion all the way down to the organ itself, right? So notice how there's interconnections, right, between the ganglion, between each ganglion here. Those are called white ramus communicants, right? So these are extensions of spinal nerves that interconnect the sympathetic ganglia right here. So again, we will see these all throughout the spinal cord, top to bottom, in this manner. Okay, so what we're looking at here is the divisions in terms of functionalities, right? For example, the structures of the head and the neck that are sympathetic are gonna go and have an origin on the superior cervical ganglion within the sympathetic chain, right, which is right there. These next ones, thoracic, and these next ganglia right here are going to go ahead and control thoracic viscera or thoracic organs. The next few are going to go ahead and have an interconnection, right, to another ganglion. So they went from this ganglion to another ganglion located on the aorta, right? In case we don't know where the aorta is, the aorta is the biggest artery that we have that comes out of the left ventricle of the heart. So these ganglions interconnect some of the sympathetic nerves so that they can go ahead and control abdominal viscera or abdominal organs. All right, so we have major divisions there because the ANS has a big influence, a huge influence in the abdominal viscera, and I'll go over those in a bit. All right, so again, if it's gonna be abdominal, so if there must be abdominal stimulation, then two interconnections must be made. One is the sympathetic chain, and the other one is an aortic ganglion. One of these five right here. All of them are going to control abdominal organs. Okay, so this is what I meant back when I said that there were several ways to transfer signals. Well, here it is. There is a direct way, which you're looking at here in the middle. And there's either a downwards or an upwards means to go ahead and do that. So again, if the signal must be taken down, then it's going to go ahead and originate on the brain, travel down the spinal cord, and then take one of these three ways, right? Either from the spinal nerve onto the same level ganglion, it can either go up into another ganglion and then from there to the organ, or go down into another ganglion and then from there to the organ, or perhaps even a collateral aortic ganglion right here. So those are the three ways in which sympathetic communication can take place. Now, in terms of neurotransmitters, we've talked about a few so far, right? Neurotransmitters have their receptors. For example, the one we're looking at here is an adrenergic receptor, an A2 alpha 2 receptor, or adrenergic receptor. So if this adrenergic receptor does not have any or norepinephrine bound to it, then it allows for acetylcholine to be transferred. But if there's norepinephrine bound to it, then no acetylcholine is released, right? So there's no postganglionic neuron activity, right? So again, no norepinephrine allows for acetylcholine to be transferred to the postganglionic neuron. And then with acetylcholine, that transfer does not occur. Therefore, the postganglionic neuron is not going to be stimulated, right? So what does that mean in terms of the organ, right? If this happens here, then the organ might be activated, right? So there might be some innervation to the organ because there's acetylcholine, which is causing a postganglionic stimulation. But then here, since there's no stimulation, then the organ might not be active, right? So that's essentially what that means. That's the implication of no norepinephrine, and yes, an epinephrine, right? Or norepinephrine. Okay, so now down to the organ level, right? What does each organ do that is sympathetic or parasympathetic? So here it is. And we're talking about sympathetic organs, right? Sympathetic stimulation. Keep in mind, it all starts in the sympathetic ganglion, right? Which is located a couple of inches away from the spinal cord. If it reaches the eye, right, the eyes are going to go ahead and dilate. The pupils are going to dilate, allowing more light to enter. Therefore, the person is probably gonna be reacting to some sort of stimulus, right? So, maybe you saw, I don't know, you saw something that kind of shocked you, and you needed to move away from it quickly, right? This is essentially what happens. You allow your eyes to take in more light, so your vision improves temporarily. So you can go ahead and either fight or flee from the situation, right? So that's sympathetic stimulation to the eye. The salivary glands can increase in secretion in certain cells, but mostly if it's sympathetic, then you probably don't want too much stimulation to the salivary glands. Right, so you're probably going to decrease overall function of these salivary glands, but you cannot decrease down to zero, because otherwise your mouth cavity is gonna be all dry, right? Which is not good. So, and essentially what it comes down to is digestion, right? During fight or flight, well, you might not want to be digesting too much, right? You want to allocate most of the energy to fighting or fleeing from a situation, essentially, right? That's basically what it is. And salivary glands are digestive. Next is the heart. So evidently what the heart is going to do is it's going to go in and pump harder, right? So the heart rate is going to increase, therefore increasing blood pressure. And we're still talking about norepinephrine, the effects of norepinephrine here. All right, so again, sympathetic, heart rate increases, blood pressure increases, as well as cardiac output increasing. The lungs, right? The lungs are also going to increase. So first and foremost, the airways. Airways are going to dilate, allowing for more air to move into the lungs. Therefore, the rate of respiration is going to increase, right? Normally, I believe the normal rate of respiration is about 12 or to 15 or something like that at rest. So that's going to increase to over 20 per minute, right? Under sympathetic stimulation. The heart normally is about 60 to 90, 100 more or less, normally at rest. But under sympathetic stimulation, it might go up all the way up to 180, right? If you're an athlete, you might go all the way up to 180, and that increases performance there. Okay, so obviously that's going to go down as soon as sympathetic stimulation returns to normal. Now, sweat glands are also going to go ahead and increase in function, releasing more sweat under sympathetic stimulation. Superficial blood vessels are going to go ahead and dilate, right? They're going to vasodilate to allow more blood to go ahead and create, to stimulate sweat glands so they can create more sweat. Why would that be? Well, because what you want to do is you want to go ahead and decrease body temperature, right? So when your blood pressure goes up, metabolic rate goes up. Therefore, more heat is created, right? So you want to dissipate a lot of that heat fast. Then we have skeletal muscle. Obviously, we want more skeletal muscle action. Therefore, vasodilation needs to take place. So the arteries systemically are going to dilate, open up, to bring more blood, oxygenated blood to the muscles, so that muscles can perform a lot better. Next ones here are going to be digestive, right? So if it's for example digestion, stomach, for example, right? You might not, again, want to spend too much energy digesting and churning out food because you're under sympathetic stimulation, right? So your digestion is probably going to decrease temporarily, including your stomach, your small intestine, your large intestine, your liver, are for the most part going to go ahead and decrease in action, all of them. Again, because you want to allocate most of the energy towards movement in fight or flight or sympathetic stimulation right there. Kidneys are probably going to decrease in function. The bladder is also gonna go ahead and decrease in function. But the adrenal glands located on top of the kidneys, they're going to increase, they're going to go up in function. Why is that? Well, because they release epinephrine and norepinephrine, which are needed for sympathetic stimulation. The adrenal glands are part of the endocrine system. Okay, once we get to it, we'll describe those hormones right there. For now, the adrenal glands increase, digestive secretions decrease, and then mostly everything else increases, except for the salivary glands, because those are mostly digestive. Again, the adrenal medulla is mostly endocrine, right? So we'll talk about it when we get to the endocrine system in a couple of weeks. So just for now, just know that epinephrine and norepinephrine are needed for sympathetic stimulation. They're adrenaline, essentially. All right, so lastly, we have the parasympathetic nervous system and the organs for it. Again, these originate on the brainstem and the sacral region, right? So we've we described all of these cranial nerves and the spinal nerves as well, but spinal nerves are not part of the parasympathetic. It's mostly sacral and cranial. So, what are the organs going to do, right? It's almost the opposite, right? For example, the eyes are going to go ahead and constrict. So you don't need too much light in the retinas, right? Because again, you're not fleeing, you're not fighting, you're essentially resting. So you need less light so you can rest better, right? So that's what happens. Now, salivary glands are digestive. You want to increase secretions of saliva to help you digest a lot better. Lacrimal glands, you want to increase those too, so that your eyes can be cleaned, right? Your heart is probably going to go down. Your heart rate is going to go down. Cardiac output goes down. Blood pressure goes down, all the way down to the 60s, right? 60s in heart rate, 120/80 in blood pressure, or even a little lower than that. And then what are the lungs going to do? Well, they're also going to go down to homeostasis, which is anywhere from 12 to 16 respirations per minute. The airways are going to constrict. Why is that? Well, because you don't need a lot of air, right? You're not running, you're not exercising, therefore, you only need a certain amount of air, right, to survive and rest, if you will. Now, mostly everything digestive is going to increase, and so not mostly, everything digestive is going to go ahead and increase in function. Like the stomach increases churning of food, so it's going to go ahead and churn that food faster and break it down. Small intestine is going to increase its absorption of nutrients. The liver is going to increase its bile secretions and also its removal of waste products from the food. The large intestine increases its output of feces, essentially, because that's what the large intestine does. It forms waste in the form of feces. And then since peristalsis is up, then that'll probably lead to an increase in defecation, right? Which is again the last part of digestion there. The kidneys are going to increase their output of urine, and then they fill up the bladder, evidently, right? And the bladder leads to higher increased urination, right? So for that, we have sphincter muscles on the inferior aspect of the bladder. Those muscles need to be relaxed so that urine can be released. All right, so this is just the interplay between the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous systems. Right here, again, we talked about all of this. As a quick review, both of these are part of the autonomic nervous system. We have sympathetic, which is fight or flight, essentially. We have parasympathetic, which is rest and digest. Right? So under sympathetic, you want mostly thoracic and lumbar nerves to be activated. Under parasympathetic, you want brainstem and sacral nerves to be activated. The neurotransmitters are almost, they're essentially the same in both acetylcholine. But the thing is that the parasympathetic does not utilize adrenaline, right? It uses acetylcholine. That's the difference between the two. Whereas sympathetic utilizes adrenaline in the form of norepinephrine and epinephrine, right there.